bigger on the inside than we are on the outside. Reminds me of a concept about self sometimes, that I often have a tendency to judge other people, if you can imagine that. And I tend to judge them by their outsides and judge me by my insides. And I shouldn't ought to judge them by their outsides, because we're told you can't tell a book by its cover, either good or bad. When you look at the cover, you really don't know what's inside the book. And the choir this morning, as always, thank you. And they sing such great songs. And this one wanted me to come out of retirement again and join them and sing, because I really wanted to sing and make it really ring out loud. Victory in Jesus, because that's what that song is. It's an old gospel song to really let it all hang out. But victory in Jesus is kind of coincidentally, I guess, what the sermon is all about. I hope the sermon, like the song, shows to us that how the littlest, the smallest, or even the least of those can indeed find victory in Jesus. I think this story of Zacchaeus is such a great story because it shows that it isn't what you seem to be, what you look like, or even what others think that you might be. It is really about what you actually are, or at least in God's eyes, what you can become. The story of how Jesus sees Zacchaeus and his salvation is truly one of grace. Call it amazing grace. It's a true victory. There are some who say that being tall is an advantage in our culture. I wonder if you knew that taller males make considerably more money in the marketplace than do their shorter counterparts. It's a fact. If you're 6'2" or taller, you're likely to start a new job at an average of 12.4% more money than somebody who is under 6 feet will make. And that doesn't make sense, and it isn't fair, but that's the way it is. In fact, studies have been made that each extra inch in height is worth an extra $600 a year. Now, can you imagine that? What difference does being taller make unless you're screwing in light bulbs in high ceilings, or unless you're playing for the National Basketball Association? Some years ago, there was a survey of 1,200 MBAs, Masters of Business, and their average salary at that time was $43,000 a year. 6-foot people in that group made on an average of $4,200 more than the shorter counterparts of graduate MBAs. And as I say, that discrepancy just makes absolutely no sense. But really, discrimination for any reason absolutely makes no sense. Doesn't make any difference why we discriminate. It never makes sense. But I go back to the National Basketball Association to show you what's wrong with that thinking. There is an exception in the NBA that taller is better. A few years ago, there was a guy by the name of Spud Webb who was 5 feet 5 inches tall, shortest guy to ever play in the NBA. And he starred for several years with the Atlanta Hawks of the NBA. And he was always the shortest of his crowd going to school. And he says he prayed when he was in junior high and when he was in senior high that somehow or another God would make him bigger than he was. He says, I prayed for that, and each time I went to measure myself, each time I went to the stand in front of the mirror, I was always the same height. It never changed. And so he says, finally he got a message, and he prayed to God. And he said, oh Lord, if you won't make me bigger on the outside, make me bigger on the inside. And he said that thought is what helped him to be successful throughout his career, that he could be bigger on the inside. What a great attitude. What a wonderful attitude for all of us to have. To be bigger on the inside. You see, the final measure of a man or of a woman is not on how big they are on the outside, not on what they seem to be on the outside, but how big they are on the inside, who they really, truly are. And see, that's what the lesson of Zacchaeus is all about. Young people in Sunday school and church camp over the years, and I suspect many of you sitting here today have learned the song. Zacchaeus was a wee little man was he. He climbed up in the sycamore tree for the Lord he wanted to see. And the Savior passed that way, and he looked up in the tree and he said, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. Today I want to go to your house. You see, Zacchaeus is one of the shortest men in the history of the Bible. Probably one of the more famous of all short people in all written and actual history. Why? Because there was this one day that Jesus was passing through Jericho, which was the hometown of Zacchaeus. And Zacchaeus was the chief tax collector in Jericho, and he was quite wealthy. In spite of his wealth, he wanted to see Jesus, but he wasn't able to because he was so short, and he couldn't see from behind the crowd. So he ran ahead of the crowd to get ahead of them, and then he crawled up this sycamore tree, and that way he could get a better view and he could see this person that he had heard so much about, this Jesus. And when Jesus reached the sycamore tree, he looked up and he said, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. And Zacchaeus came down immediately, and he welcomed the Lord into his house. And the people in the crowd began to mutter, he is gone to be the guest of a sinner. And they were right. Zacchaeus was really, by society standards, a sinner of the worst kind. He was loathsome. You know, as we noted, he was the chief tax collector, and probably for the Roman government, certainly not for the Jewish government. And he was in a prosperous city of Jericho. And one commentator remarks that he probably had a staff a lot of other tax collectors out working for him, and he and his cohorts could stop anybody. They could stop you or me, and they could put a tax on the wheels of our cart. They could put a tax on the cart itself. They could put a tax on the goods that were in the cart. Whatever they wanted to tax, they could tax. And then they sent a small portion of what they collected to the Roman government. And they kept everything over and above that. That system was even more ripe for abuse than the system we call income tax. He accumulated great wealth. And it was accumulated as a result of being loyal to the invaders of his country. And so Zacchaeus was really regarded, along with the Romans, as nothing more than human filth. His name, Zacchaeus, meant the pure one, or the righteous one. And to his fellow Jews, he did not seem very pure. He did not seem very righteous. In fact, the mention of his name didn't evoke too many smiles, too many grins, but they evoked a lot of disgust. And so you see, this is the kind of man that Jesus went home with. It's almost as if Jesus enjoyed stirring up a crowd and poking a finger in their eye and saying, "See this? I go with the worst sinner of all of you." So Jesus was in this scene where he was dining with the most vile and the most hated man and the most corrupt man in the whole country. No wonder Jesus was so darn controversial. And Jesus showed what true grace is. And we need to understand one thing about grace, and that is that grace is always controversial when it's lived out. You know, we sing with great gusto that wonderful song about grace, Amazing Grace, one of my favorite of all hymns, and we sing with great gusto. But yet, at the same time, we're ready to join the lynch party if grace is ever extended to somebody that lives in a way that we don't approve of, somebody who is different than we are, what we call the other. We're ready to join the lynch party the minute somebody starts to criticize those people. And here the crowd muttered about Zacchaeus and saying, Jesus even eats dinner with the worst of the sinners. And meanwhile, at this meal, something very extraordinary happened. Zacchaeus climbed up to his feet, had to stand up on a chair, and he made an astounding announcement to the people there. He said to Jesus, "Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anybody, I will pay back 4 times the amount." Well, this encounter with Jesus is what changed the heart of Zacchaeus. It gave him, even no matter how small he was, a big heart. You see, Zacchaeus went far beyond what the law demanded. And the Old Testament is clear on how you make amends and apologize. It says if you're repaying stolen property, you pay what you stole plus 20%. That's biblical from the Old Testament. Pay what you stole plus 20%. and that was considered adequate restitution. Only in violent acts of robbery was fourfold restitution suggested in the Bible. And then for Zacchaeus to give 1/2 of all his wealth in addition to the 20%, or the 4 times actually that he was giving, was kind of icing on the cake. So Zacchaeus is a case of dramatic repentance. And Jesus said, that's why Jesus said to Zacchaeus, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man is too a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save what was lost." This is what grace looks like. Come to save what was lost. In Jesus' death, God will voluntarily take all of the squalor and all of the damage of sin, so that all of us, you and me as well, can respond to his love freely and abundantly. You see, Zacchaeus was saved by grace, and he was invited to faith. And so are you, and so am I. We are all saved by grace and invited to faith with God. And there's another story, true story of grace and what it looks like. There was a local pastor once who told about a service at a mission in a city in the Middle West. And it was a service that the children of the congregation put on. One little boy, about 6 years old, was to give a recitation in the program. And this little boy had a birth defect. His back was so misshapen that he looked like he was a hunchback. And as he walked across the stage to give his little recitation, he was shy and he was nervous. He was not only nervous because he was misshapen and humpbacked, but it's the first time he had ever given any kind of a public performance or a public recitation. But you can imagine the consternation of a 6-year-old boy with those two things working against him doing a public recitation. It was really a struggle for that little boy. Well, there were 2 older boys in the back room, and they were chronic troublemakers. They were the real tough guys of the crowd. And just as this little boy was walking across the stage to begin his recitation, these older boys hollered out to heckle the kid. They got up and said, "Where are you going with that backpack on your back?" And the little boy stopped in his tracks and he started to cry. A man got up from the audience and he walked up to the stage. He knelt down by the boy and he put his arm around him. And then he said to the audience, "You know, it must take somebody who is awfully cruel to say such a thing as that. This boy has a condition that is not at all his fault. There's nothing he can do about it. And he loves Jesus, and he wanted to come here and he wanted to recite something to show you all what Jesus means to him and to his life. And I want you to know that I'm proud of this young boy because he is my own son. I love him just the way he is. and he belongs to me. The man hugged his son and led him off the platform. I love him just the way he is. And he is mine. He is my child. You see, that's what God says to you, and that's what God says to me. It makes no difference who we are, what we've done, what we look like, how tall or how short we are, how thin or how heavy. All that matters is that we are a child of God and that Christ gave himself in our behalf. He gave his life for each and every one of us. And so I say today in prayer, O Lord, I pray this day you make me bigger on the inside than I am on the outside. Amen.